Most people have exactly one pipe carrying money into their life. One. They spend 40 hours a week protecting that pipe, worrying about that pipe, basing their entire self-worth on whether that pipe keeps flowing. Then one day, a restructuring, a health event, a new manager who doesn't like them, a software update that made their role unnecessary, and the pipe is gone, and they're sitting there with no backup system, no secondary flow, no plan. Just a savings account that starts draining on day one. Here's what's weird. Everyone knows this is a fragile setup. Everyone. You're not discovering something new when you realize that relying on one employer for 100% of your income is a bad design. It's obviously a bad design, but most people do absolutely nothing about it for years, sometimes decades. Why? That's the question. And the answer is not what most people think it is. Because the obvious answer is laziness or lack of motivation. That's what everyone says. People are just comfortable, and that's wrong. That's completely wrong. The real answer is structural. The system is set up so that building a second income is deliberately difficult for people inside it. Not maliciously difficult, just structurally difficult. And understanding that difference changes everything about how you approach it. We're going to explain how building a second income while working a 9-to-5 actually works, why most people attempt it in entirely the wrong order, and why the first year is almost always the hardest and least profitable part by design. Let me introduce the metaphor I'm going to use for this entire video because it's going to make everything click faster than any motivational speech ever could. Think of income as pipes. You have pipes that carry money into your life. Most people have one pipe. It's a big pipe, their salary, and it's controlled by someone else. The valve is on their side, not yours. You just receive what flows through. You can influence the flow slightly, work harder, get promoted, negotiate, but ultimately you don't control the pipe. Someone else does. The goal of building a second income is not to make more money in some abstract feel-good sense. The goal is to build a second pipe, or a third. Pipes that you control the valve on. Pipes that can run in parallel. And ideally, over time, pipes that don't require you to physically stand next to them for them to keep flowing. That's it. That's the whole game. Everything I'm going to tell you tonight is about pipes. How to start small ones without breaking your main pipe. How to connect them to each other. How to make them self-sustaining. And critically, how most people accidentally build pipes that are actually just buckets. They collect a little water once and then they're empty. Let me start from the beginning. The first thing you have to understand about working a 9-to-5 is that it's a specifically designed environment. And like any designed environment, it has incentives. Some visible, some not. The visible incentive is simple. You trade time for money, show up, do the work, get paid. That's the contract. And it's honest. There's nothing wrong with the contract itself. The invisible incentive is the one nobody talks about at orientation. The job by design should consume all the energy you have left after it's done. Not because your employer is evil, just because that's what happens when humans spend 8 or 9 hours in a structured, mentally demanding environment. You come home and you want to sit down, you want to decompress, you want to eat something, you want to stop thinking, and that's completely normal. That's biology. Your brain burned glucose all day navigating social dynamics, solving problems, processing email, being slightly on guard. It wants rest. The problem is that building a second income is not a rest activity. It requires exactly the kind of focused, creative, uncertain work that your brain is least prepared to do at 7 in the evening after a full workday. So the people who succeed don't have more willpower. They don't wake up somehow more energized than everyone else. What they do is they change the geometry of the problem. They remove friction from the equation before they start so that the energy requirement goes from 100 to something closer to 40. And they start much smaller than feels worth it. Here's the 3-level structure I use to think about this. Because there are really only 3 types of second income pipes, and most people try to build the wrong type first. Level 1 is what I call the active swap. You're basically doing a second job, freelancing, consulting, driving for a delivery app, doing weekend gigs. You trade time for money just like your 9-to-5, except this time you control the pipe. The upside, you can start immediately, you have skills, people will pay for them. The downside, this pipe only flows when you're standing next to it, and it drains you even faster than your main job because there's no structure holding it up. Level 2 is what I call the asymmetric build. This is where you spend time building something once that generates returns repeatedly. Content, software tools, small businesses with systems, digital products, income-generating assets. The upside, the pipe can eventually run without you. The downside, there's a long lag between effort and result. Usually 6 to 18 months where you're pouring energy in and almost nothing is coming out. Most people quit here. Level 3 is what I call the compounding pipe. This is capital deployed into assets that generate returns, stocks, real estate, private equity, whatever. The math is simple and brutal. You need money to start this one. At $30,000 invested at 8% annually, you're making about $2,400 a year. That's not a second income. That's a nice dinner fund. You need serious capital before this pipe moves the needle in a meaningful way. Most people hear second income and they skip level 1 because it sounds too basic. Try to go straight to level 2 without understanding the lag, get frustrated in month 3, and then tell everyone it doesn't work. The real move, which I'll get into in more detail later, is to use level 1 to fund the early stages of level 2 and use level 2 over time to fund level 3. They're not separate strategies. They're phases of the same pipe system. Now let me talk about what actually kills second income attempts, because it's not what you think. You think the problem is time. I don't have enough time. That's the number one excuse, and to be fair, it's not entirely wrong. Time is genuinely scarce when you're working full-time. But time is not the actual bottleneck. The actual bottleneck is decision fatigue combined with a broken feedback loop. Here's what I mean. Every day you go to work, you get feedback, you do a task, something happens, someone responds, you see results. The feedback loop is short. You feel productive. Your brain registers progress. When you come home and sit down to work on something you're building from scratch, a YouTube channel, a freelance client base, a newsletter, a small e-commerce operation, the feedback loop is completely broken. You put in 2 hours and nothing happens. Nothing. No one sees it, no revenue, no validation. The rational part of your brain starts filing reports like, this is a waste of time and you should just go to sleep. And because you're already decision fatigued from the day, you don't have the mental resources to fight that narrative. So you stop. This is why people quit, not because the thing doesn't work, but because they can't handle operating in a broken feedback loop while also being exhausted. And that's a solvable problem, but you solve it with systems, not motivation. The solution is to engineer tiny, visible progress markers so your brain gets something to register. Not vanity metrics, not follower counts, actual leading indicators. Did I reach out to 3 potential clients today? Yes. Did I publish 1 piece of content? Yes. Those are real inputs. And inputs over time produce outputs. But you have to train your brain to track inputs when outputs aren't coming yet. I know someone, not me, just someone I observed, who spent 4 months building a newsletter about personal finance before he had a single paying subscriber. He was going to quit in month 3. He had 48 subscribers, $0, and a growing feeling that he was an idiot. What stopped him from quitting was that he started tracking open rates instead of subscriber counts. His open rates were actually very high, around 40%, which told him that the people who found him actually cared. That was the leading indicator that the system was working before the money showed up. He kept going. By month 9, he had 1,000 subscribers and was making about $800 a month from 1 sponsorship and a small premium tier. By month 18, he sold the newsletter for a little over $60,000 to a media company. That's not a spectacular story. Nobody's writing a book about him, but that's the point. Second incomes don't usually make you famous. They just make you less financially fragile. And sometimes, if you build the right pipe, they make you genuinely wealthy in a quiet, boring way that nobody at your old job ever hears about. Let me get into the mechanics of actually starting, because the planning phase is where most people stay forever. If you're working a 9 to 5 right now and you want to build a second income, here is the order of operations that I've found actually works, versus the order that sounds right but doesn't. What sounds right? Pick your passion, build a product around it, grow an audience, monetize. What actually works? Identify one skill you already have that someone would pay for, Get one paying customer as fast as possible, then use that proof of concept to decide if it's worth scaling. The reason most people start with passion is that it feels more sustainable, and emotionally, it makes sense. You're going to be doing this on top of a full-time job, so it better be something you enjoy, right? The problem is that passion doesn't validate market demand. You can be deeply passionate about something that nobody will pay for. And the worst situation you can be in is spending 8 months building something with passion, only to discover the market doesn't exist. Now you're broke, burned out, and cynical. Contrast that with someone who starts with the question, what do I already know how to do? And who needs it? This person gets their first $200 in week 2, then $300 in week 3. The feedback loop is short. The dopamine is real. And even if it's not their dream project, the experience of making money outside a paycheck does something to your psychology that I genuinely cannot overstate. It changes the way you see income. You go from income is something that happens to me to income is something I can create. That shift sounds simple. It's not simple. It's the difference between an employee mindset and an ownership mindset. And it doesn't come from reading books. It comes from making your first dollar outside of a salary. Let me give you a number to calibrate your expectations. Most people who successfully build a second income hit their first $1,000 per month somewhere between month 8 and month 14. Not month 1, not month 3, month 8 to 14. If you expect it faster, you'll quit. If you plan for that timeline, you can actually build something real. Here's where it gets more interesting, and this is where most people's mental models completely break down. Once you have a second income going, even a small one, you now have 2 currencies that are generating returns. You have money, obviously, but you also have data, information about what works. And data is more valuable than the money in the early stages, because data tells you where to allocate more effort. Most people treat their second income as a side project, a little thing they check on occasionally, a fun experiment. And that framing keeps it small. The people who scale it treat it like a machine they're running diagnostics on. Every week they look at it the way an engineer looks at a system. What's performing, what isn't? Where are the inefficiencies? What's the highest leverage thing I can do this week with the 3 hours I have available? The pipe metaphor applies here too. You don't randomly throw water at your pipes and hope some gets in. You look at your system and ask, where is the flow actually going and where is it leaking? I track my channels and projects like I would a portfolio. Not emotionally, just analytically. This piece of content performed 30% better than average. Why? This client paid on time, gave referrals, and never complained. How do I get more of this type of client? This revenue stream took 10 hours a week and produced $400 a month. Is that the best use of those 10 hours? Or is there something I can redirect them toward that produces more? That kind of thinking is not natural. It's trained. And once you start thinking that way, you start seeing opportunities that are completely invisible to people who are still in emotional mode about their finances. If you're finding this useful and you want to keep up with this kind of thinking on a regular basis, subscribe. I post on this channel whenever I have something worth saying, which is not every week, but when I do, it's the kind of stuff that I genuinely think about, test, and actually use. You don't have to agree with everything. Just think it through. Let me talk about what actually happened in my own situation, without making this sound like a LinkedIn post. I was working. Not a glamorous job, just a regular job where I sat in front of a computer, did reasonably well, and got a decent paycheck every 2 weeks. The paycheck felt secure, and that security was genuinely comfortable. And then one day I sat down and did a very basic calculation. If I kept doing exactly this, in 10 years I would have a slightly bigger paycheck, maybe a small amount of savings if I was disciplined, and absolutely zero assets that worked for me. The trajectory was not exciting. It wasn't a disaster. I wasn't going to be homeless. But it wasn't going anywhere interesting either. It was just flat. A flat line with occasional small bumps when I got a raise. And here's the thing about flat lines in finance. Inflation eats them. A salary that stays roughly the same over 10 years, with 3% inflation per year, is actually a salary that's declining in real terms. You're on a treadmill that's slowly speeding up, and you feel like you're standing still. That calculation, not a motivational video, not a book, not someone telling me to believe in myself. That calculation made something shift in my brain. I didn't need to feel inspired. I needed to see the math and accept what it was saying. So I started small, very small, embarrassingly small in retrospect. I started writing about things I already understood, economics, systems, money mechanics. and putting it online. I did not make any money for a long time. I want to be honest about that timeline because I think the way people tell success stories online is completely dishonest about the early stages. The early stages were boring and unrewarding. I would spend 2 hours on something and get approximately zero feedback on it. I kept going not because I was passionate, but because I had decided to give it 18 months before evaluating whether to quit. That decision, setting the evaluation date far enough in the future, removed the daily temptation to reassess and give up. By month 6, I was making a few $100s a month. By month 12, I was making closer to $1,000. By the end of year 2, across a couple of channels and projects, I was in the range of $100,000 total generated outside of my regular income. Not all of that was profit. Some of it went back into the systems. But the number was real. I'm not telling you this to impress you. $100,000 over 2 years is not extraordinary. There are people who did that in 3 months with the right product at the right time. I'm telling you because I know exactly how I did it. Slowly, systematically, and without any single moment that felt like a breakthrough. It was just consistent operation of a system with regular diagnostics for long enough to get compound effects. Let me talk about the tax piece, because most people building a second income get this completely wrong and it costs them a significant amount of money. When you have a salary, taxes are handled for you. Your employer withholds, you file, you maybe get a refund. Clean, simple, invisible. When you build a second income, especially through self-employment or business income, you are now responsible for tracking, estimating, and paying taxes that are not automatically withheld. And if you're not careful, you can end up owing a substantial amount at tax time that you didn't plan for. Here's a rough framework. If you're generating income through freelancing, content, or a small business, plan to set aside somewhere between 25 and 30% of every dollar you make. Not because that's exactly what you'll owe. The actual number depends on your total income, your deductions, your structure, but because it's a safe, conservative buffer. Put it in a separate account. Don't touch it. Don't treat it as income. The second thing is structure matters. There is a meaningful difference in terms of how you're taxed between operating as an individual, operating as a sole proprietor, and operating as an S corporation, for example. I'm not a tax advisor, but I'll tell you that running my income through the right structure versus the wrong one can save someone at my level somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 a year. That's not nothing. That's multiple pipe upgrades per year. The people who ignore the structural piece because taxes are complicated are leaving real money on the table. And ironically, they're the same people who grind for weeks to make an extra $300 on a side project, then hand back $500 in unnecessary taxes because they never figured out the structure. Prioritize the structure early. It's boring, it costs money up front to get set up correctly, and it saves you significantly more over time. Now let me build on the pipe metaphor because we're getting into the part that most financial advice completely skips over. There's a concept I think about a lot when it comes to second incomes, and I call it pipe dependency. Pipe dependency is when your second income becomes just as dependent on your constant attention as your first income. You've built a second job, not a second income. This is the trap that catches almost everybody in the level 1 phase that I described earlier. You're freelancing, making money, feeling good, but you realize that if you took 2 weeks off, the income would stop. You haven't built a pipe. You've built a bucket brigade, where you're the one carrying the buckets. Breaking out of pipe dependency is the actual hard part of building a second income that matters. And it requires a shift in how you think about your time investment. When you're at level 1, the active swap, every hour you put in produces output. That's fine as a start. But every hour you're at level 1, you should also be asking, what can I do right now that reduces the number of hours I need to put in later for the same output? That question is the question that separates people who build durable second incomes from people who just have exhausting second jobs. For content creation, it might be building systems around content production so that the research, outline, recording, and editing become a repeatable process that gets faster over time. For freelancing, it might be productizing your service, packaging it into a fixed scope, fixed price offer so you stop doing custom work from scratch every time. For e-commerce, it might be automating the fulfillment layer. For newsletters, it might be creating an evergreen sequence that runs automatically for new subscribers. The specific tactic depends on your specific pipe. But the underlying principle is always the same. You are not just doing the work, you are engineering the system that does the work. And I'll tell you right now, most people never make this shift because it requires sacrificing short-term output for long-term leverage. In month 4 of your side project, when you're barely making $300 a month, the last thing you want to do is spend time building systems instead of producing content or delivering client work. But the people who do it anyway are the ones who look up in month 18 and realize their pipe is now flowing at 20% of the effort it used to require. Let me do a quick comedic pause because I'm starting to sound like a productivity podcast and that's not who I am. The classic advice is just wake up at 5 in the morning. Right. So the solution to being exhausted from your job is to also become sleep deprived. Brilliant. Who authorized this? Show me the data. Every study on cognitive performance says you need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. But yes, definitely sacrifice that so you can be barely functional in both your job and your side project simultaneously. That's the move, okay? Back to systems. Let me talk about leverage, because it's the concept that most 9-to-5 workers have no intuitive feel for, and it's the reason why some people seem to build second incomes faster than others with seemingly less effort. Leverage, in the context of building income, means using one resource to amplify the output of another resource. It's not magic. It's just geometry. The most common forms of leverage available to someone working a 9-to-5 are audience leverage, capital leverage, and time leverage. They work differently and require different inputs to build. Audience leverage means you've built a group of people who trust you and pay attention when you speak. If you have a genuine audience, even a small one, that is a distribution asset. You can launch products, recommend services, sell courses, get sponsors. One communication to 10,000 engaged people is worth infinitely more than 10,000 individual cold outreaches to strangers. Building an audience is slow, requires consistency, and requires that you actually say things worth listening to. But once it exists, it is a compounding asset that generates returns on every subsequent thing you create. Capital leverage means using money to make more money. You deploy your savings or your second income profits into assets that generate returns without requiring your labor. Index funds, real estate, lending platforms, whatever fits your situation. The math is straightforward and the problem is you need capital to start, which is why this is usually phase 3. But here's the thing people miss. Even small amounts of capital deployed early and consistently matter more than large amounts deployed late. $10,000 invested today at 8% average annual returns for 20 years becomes about $46,000. $20,000 invested 10 years from now for 10 years becomes about $43,000. Same result, completely different timeline, completely different amount of money invested. Time is leverage in the compounding equation, which means every year you delay deploying capital is leverage you're giving up permanently. Time leverage means your output is no longer directly proportional to your hours. This is what I described earlier when talking about pipe dependency. You've engineered systems, processes, or assets that produce output without requiring proportional time input. A video I made 6 months ago is still generating views and ad revenue today without me doing anything. That's time leverage. A template I created for a client is now part of a productized offering that takes me 2 hours to deliver instead of 20. That's time leverage. The goal, if you're serious about building real financial independence, is to stack all three eventually. Audience that you speak to, capital that compounds, time that is partially freed from direct labor. None of these happen quickly, but they all start somewhere small, and they all get better the longer you run them. Let me talk about a mistake I see constantly, and it is genuinely painful to watch. Someone starts a second income. It's going okay, a few hundred to a few $1,000s a month, and then they immediately reinvest all of their time into growing that second income to the point where they start underperforming at their main job. And then they lose their main job. And suddenly they're trying to survive entirely on a second income that was designed to be a supplement, not a foundation. And because they weren't ready for that, the second income collapses under the pressure. Because they start making desperate decisions, taking bad clients, discounting their products, posting erratically because they're stressed. The pipe analogy, they tried to redirect the main pipe before the second pipe was big enough to handle the flow. And now they're standing in a puddle. Keep your main pipe intact until the second pipe is generating enough to replace at minimum 80% of what your main pipe provides. That's not a conservative number. That's a structural requirement. You need that buffer because your second income will have volatile months. It's not a salary, it fluctuates, and you need your main pipe to absorb those fluctuations while you're still building. I've seen people quit their jobs on $2,000 a month of side income. That's brave and incredibly risky. I've seen people wait until they hit $8,000 or $10,000 per month of side income before making the transition. And those transitions almost always go smoothly. Not because the person who waited was smarter, because they had enough pipe volume to absorb variance. Here's the part nobody is particularly comfortable talking about. The social dimension of building a second income while working full-time. When you start redirecting 3 to 4 hours of your evening into a project, you are by definition spending less time doing other things, less time socializing, less time watching things, less time in general leisure mode. And depending on your social circle, that creates friction. People around you will notice, some will be curious, some will be supportive, and some, often without realizing it, will be subtly discouraging. Not because they want you to fail, but because your behavior is a mirror, and when you're doing something ambitious with your evenings, it implicitly raises the question of why they're not. I'm not saying become a hermit. I'm saying understand the social mechanics so you're not caught off guard when your friend group starts making jokes about your little business thing or asking why you never hang out anymore. It's not personal. It's just the system pushing back. The best response is not to explain yourself constantly. Just produce results quietly, keep your relationships maintained at a reasonable level, and let the results speak when they're ready to speak. You don't owe anyone a TED Talk about your ambitions. Let me give you the 4 traps that kill most second income attempts, because I want you to be able to recognize them when they show up for you. Trap 1. Infinite research mode. This is where someone spends weeks or months reading about how to start, watching videos about strategy, comparing tools and platforms, but never actually doing the thing. The research is real, the plan is detailed, the action is zero. Information consumption mimics action in a way that feels productive but produces nothing. The fix is to set a deadline. You get 1 week of research, maximum, then you start. The learning that actually matters happens when you're doing it, not before. Trap 2. Premature scaling. This is where someone makes their first $500 and immediately spends $400 on ads, outsourcing tools, and a logo redesign. You don't know enough yet to scale. You don't know which part of your offer actually resonated, which customers are the right ones, what the actual unit economics look like. Premature scaling amplifies mistakes. The fix is to do things manually until you understand every part of the system. Then automate or scale what you understand. Trap 3, the wrong comparison. This is where you look at someone who is 3 years into building their second income and compare your month 4 results to their month 36 results. And then you feel like you're failing. You're not failing. You're just early. The comparison is between a different time in the timeline, not a different level of ability. The fix is to compare your month 4 to your month 1, not to someone else's year 3. Trap 4. Income diversification without income consolidation. This is a subtle one. You start 3 different income streams simultaneously, put partial effort into each, and end up with 3 things that barely produce anything instead of 1 thing that works. The fix is to go deep on 1 stream until it's stable, meaning it runs with relatively predictable inputs and outputs, before you start building the next one. Sequential pipes beat simultaneous half-built pipes every time. And here is a second comedic pause, because I realize I just gave you 4 consecutive serious frameworks, and you deserve a break. You know what the easiest second income is? Telling other people how to make a second income. I say this with full self-awareness. The meta layer of the internet, people teaching what they just learned, is enormous. It is a vast, thriving ecosystem of people 3 steps ahead teaching people 2 steps behind them. And it works because the person 2 steps behind doesn't need someone 20 steps ahead. They need someone who just figured out the thing they're currently stuck on. I find this both funny and completely logical. The market rewards proximity to the problem, not distance from it. Let me build to the part that I think is the most counterintuitive insight in this entire video, because I've been building toward it and I don't want to waste it. Most people think the hardest part of building a second income is the first part. Starting, getting momentum, making the first dollar. And yes, that part is hard. But the actually dangerous part is later. The dangerous part is when your second income is working and becomes comfortable. Here's what I mean. Somewhere around month 12 to month 24, if you've done things reasonably well, your second income is producing something consistent. Let's say $3,000 a month. You've put in significant effort to get there. You're proud of it. And subconsciously, you start protecting it. You stop experimenting. You stop taking risks. You optimize for stability in the thing that used to be your experimental side project. And in doing that, you accidentally convert your second income into a second job with more paperwork. The $3,000 a month is real and it matters. But if the system is stable enough to produce it consistently, that's actually a signal to start building the next pipe, not to coast. Because $3,000 a month is not financial independence, it's financial buffer. And financial independence requires more pipes or much bigger pipes or both. This is where the level 1 to level 2 to level 3 progression I described earlier becomes critical. The people who end up actually wealthy from second incomes are the ones who used each stable pipe as a launching pad for the next one, rather than treating each stable pipe as the destination. The destination thinking is the trap, and it's a comfortable trap which makes it especially dangerous. Let me be specific about the math because I think abstraction is where most financial content loses people. Imagine someone, called an M, who is working a 9 to 5 making $4,000 a month after taxes. They decide to build a second income. They start freelancing in their field, something they can offer immediately without additional training, and they land their first client in week 3 for $500 per project. By month 3, they're making an extra $800 a month from 2 regular clients. They save all of it. They spend nothing extra. At month 6, they productize. They package their service into a fixed offering that's slightly cheaper than their custom work, but requires significantly less of their time. This lets them take on more clients with the same hours. Monthly income from the pipe, $1,800. They take $500 of that monthly and start investing it into a broad market index fund. They leave the rest as a cash buffer. By month 12, they have accumulated about $8,000 in invested capital and roughly $4,000 in a savings buffer. The second income is now consistently above $2,000 per month. By month 18, something interesting happens. The accumulated capital, now around $14,000, is generating about $90 per month in passive returns. Tiny. Almost invisible, but it's a third pipe and it requires 0 of their time. By year 3, they've redirected effort from active freelancing into a productized service that runs with about 8 hours per week of their time. It's generating $4,000 per month. They've also accumulated around $40,000 in invested capital, generating maybe $250 to $300 per month. Their total income outside their main job is now in the range of $4,300 per month. They now have 2 income pipes of roughly equal size plus a small but growing capital pipe. They are not rich, but they are also not dependent on any single source. Their financial life is a different shape than it was 36 months ago, and the trajectory is compounding, not flat. That's not a fantasy. That's what systematic pipe building looks like when someone doesn't quit in month 3. Now let me come back to where I started, because I promised to return to the original hook. Most people have exactly 1 pipe. They spend their whole career managing that pipe, stressing about that pipe, making decisions about where they live and how they spend their weekends based entirely on that pipe. And when that pipe gets threatened, which it will at some point for everyone, they have nothing behind it. The reason I started building second income streams was not some grand epiphany. I just looked at the math, accepted what it was saying, and decided that a single point of failure in the most important system in my life, my income, was unacceptable given the cost of fixing it versus the cost of not fixing it. The cost of building a second income is time, energy, and patience. The cost of not building one is potentially devastating. The math is clear, and here's the thing about people who quietly build second incomes while their colleagues are complaining about their salary. They don't usually announce it. They're not on Instagram showing you their earnings screenshots. They're just running their diagnostic checks every week, adjusting their systems, and compounding quietly. The loudest voices about making money online are usually selling you something about making money online. The people actually doing it are usually too busy doing it to make a lot of noise about it. Let me give you 3 practical, non-generic takeaways that you can actually use this week. Not start a side hustle level advice. Actually specific. First, identify your starting pipe. Not the ideal pipe, not the most exciting pipe. Your starting pipe. What do you already know how to do that someone else would pay for? Write down 3 skills you have right now that have market value. Then pick one. Your starting pipe is defined by your existing capability, not your aspirations. You grow toward your aspirations from a starting point that actually generates cash. Speed of first dollar matters more than choice of first project. Second, set your evaluation date before you start. Pick a date, 12 months from now is usually right, and commit to not quitting before that date regardless of how the results look in months 2 through 7. This sounds simple. It is not easy, but it removes the daily decision to quit, which is where most energy is wasted. You're not deciding whether to continue every week, you decided once, 12 months out, and you're honoring that decision. The evaluation happens at the date, not before. Third, build the next pipe before you feel ready. Once your first pipe is stable and producing consistently, even at a modest level, start laying the groundwork for the second. Don't wait until the first one feels finished. It will never feel finished. The time to start the second pipe is when the first one is running with reasonable predictability and you have some capital and clarity from the experience. If you wait until you're ready, you're just choosing to stay smaller for longer. Those 3 things, not 10 things, not a 20-step framework, 3 things that actually move the needle at the beginning. If this kind of thinking is useful to you and you want to stay in the loop when I post, subscribe. I don't make noise, I make things worth watching.